So this camera, it has a full frame sensor inside, like nearly every other professional camera nowadays as well. And that is for a good reason, but normally these cameras are super expensive. For a new and modern full frame camera, we talk about prices like $4,000, $5,000, maybe even $6,000, again for the body only. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, because in today's video I want to explore my 5 favorite cheap full frame cameras that you can buy in 2025. And all of these are way below $1,000, and the last one might surprise you because it is super cheap. So let's dive right in. Hello my friends, and welcome to this video today. So when I got my first quote-unquote real camera, it was an APS-C camera, and I loved the thing, it was great, but I always dreamed of a full frame camera back then, because full frame was and still is the gold standard when it comes to quote-unquote professional photography. That doesn't mean, by the way, that there aren't great APS-C or micro four thirds cameras out there, but that is a topic for another. Over the years I came across a ton of variety of different full frame cameras from different manufacturers, and in this video I want to talk about the 5 cheapest ones today that you can buy for an absolute bargain. And the last camera, the cheapest one on this list, you might get for below $100 if you are lucky, so stick around for that. But now let's start with camera number 1. So camera number 1 is the Nikon Z5. And the Z5 will set you back around $800 new, not used. Used you can get them even cheaper, a lot cheaper honestly, but new it will cost you around $800. And the Z5 is basically the entry-level full-frame model from Nikon. It was released in 2020, so it's already 5 years ago. Nonetheless, 5 years is not all that much in camera years, I feel like, because it still feels pretty modern. I don't own a Z5 myself, but a friend of mine does, and I tried it out a lot, and I feel the build quality and the ergonomics is great with this camera. And what I really like is the menu, which is arguably way better than the Sony menus from the camera that I use, but that is also a story for another video. With the Z5 you get a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, which to some might feel like the lower end of megapixels, but let me tell you one thing, 24 megapixels is more than enough for basically anything. If you don't want to print your pictures on the side of a skyscraper or crop in a ton later, you will not need more than 24 megapixels. There are great videos out there who will show you the difference between, for example, 12, 24 and 60 megapixels. It's not a huge difference if you have normal sized images basically. One amazing feature that this camera has is a dual SD card slot, which comes in pretty handy if you want to shoot for clients, for example. Because if you shoot for clients, you want to have a backup of your data, and if you have the dual SD card slots, you obviously can write the data on 2 SD cards simultaneously, so you have a backup, which is pretty important and pretty good, and not all cameras in this price category does have this feature, so I feel like the Nikon Z5 is pretty good there. The lens selection for the Nikon system is also pretty great. You got a ton of Nikon internal lenses, which are amazing. You got older lenses, which are awesome. You got third-party manufacturers where you can save a lot of money when you buy off them. Or for example, if you buy used lenses, there's also a ton of availability there. So also pretty good. Honestly, there are no real downsides to this camera. One thing that could be criticized is the video features. You have 4K video, but it will crop in a lot if you shoot in 4K. Another thing is the burst mode. If you want to take a lot of pictures in quick succession, that might come as a burden there. But other than that, I feel like this camera is still pretty relevant in 2025, so I can definitely recommend this one. And again, $800 new is a pretty good deal there. Let's talk about the second camera, and this one might be somewhat of an underdog and it is not super famous anymore, I feel like. I'm talking about a Pentax K1. The first generation of this camera, not the second, that is way more expensive, but the first generation was released way back in 2016, so almost 10 years old at this point. but it still performs great. You cannot get this camera new anymore, I believe, but you can buy it used. And if you buy it used, you will find models from $600 to $700, which is a pretty good deal for what you get, because you have a DSLR there, which means you have a mirror inside that makes the camera a little bit more heavy than, for example, the Nikon Z5 I talked about a minute ago. However, this camera is incredibly sturdy. It feels like the tank of cameras. You know, it is fully weather sealed. With the Pentax, you got a 36 megapixel full frame sensor, obviously, and you got a ton of details from your photos, because this camera does not have an anti-aliasing filter, which basically all other cameras have. And this means you get this little bit more sharpness in your photos. If you look for a camera for landscape photography, this one is amazing. As I said, it is a Pentax camera, so you have the Pentax mount. When we talk about modern lenses, the options are a little bit more limited than, for example, if you look for Nikon or Canon or Sony lenses. However, there are a ton of great older lenses that you can buy used for this camera system, which are again way cheaper than buying new lenses, and it basically adds to this budget narrative of this video. So if you're looking for a landscape photography camera, this one is pretty cool, pretty amazing, and I just love to operate this camera. Let's talk about camera number 3, and this is a category of cameras basically, and I'm talking about the first generations of Sony mirrorless cameras. Sony started this whole thing basically in 2013 when they launched the Sony A7, which was basically the first full frame mirrorless camera that they offered, even before Nikon, Canon and all the other manufacturers followed eventually. You will find A7 models used, obviously there are no new ones anymore, but you will find them used for around $300 to $400. Even if you look at the newer models, like for example the A7 II, you will find models for around $500, which is an amazing deal for what you get. These cameras are super compact and lightweight. They are way more compact than the modern Sony full frame mirrorless cameras, obviously. In fact, I have one here. You can see it. This is an A7R, the second generation of the R models, which are a little bit more expensive than the normal ones. They have a little bit more megapixels, you know, R stands for resolution, so they are more or less for the landscape photographers out there, for example. And it is a great camera. This one is over 10 years old. It still performs great. It still feels pretty modern to operate, honestly. You got a ton of different lenses. You basically have the most lens options of any camera system there, because you have the Sony E-mount, and you know it. You have a ton of Sony lenses, which are great. You have a ton of older lenses, which are great. You have a ton of third-party manufacturer lenses, which are also great in most cases. So I really, really love this camera system and this camera. Again, if you have a little bit more budget, I would tend to go with the second generation of this camera, because a lot of first generation problems were fixed with the second generation. Also, you got, for example, in-body image stabilization with the A7 II, which the A7 Mark I does not feature. And this is also a pretty important feature, I believe. Also, what some people criticize is the battery life. You have quite small batteries for these cameras, and they will not last as long as batteries in the newer models from the Sony cameras. However, again, this is a budget camera, and you can obviously bring spare batteries. So I really like this camera. And I feel like when we talk about the image quality that you get per dollar, this one might be my favorite of all of these, but there are still 2 cameras to come, so let's get on now. And we are back with Nikon. I am talking about a Nikon D750, an absolute classic that professional photographers still use to this day. I at least know one who is still using the D750, and you will get one for around $400 used. This camera is a DSLR again, which means you have a mirror inside, which means that it will weigh more. It is bulkier, heavier than the mirrorless cameras in this list, but that also comes with some benefits. For example, you got a pretty ergonomic and well-built grip with this camera, which comes in pretty handy if you're outside and, you know, just grab the camera and walking around, and you don't have to worry about, you know, it slipping out of your hand or stuff like that. This camera has a 24 megapixel sensor with great dynamic range, great color. You got pretty good high ISO performances, and you also have a really reliable autofocus system, I feel like. And the autofocus, it is better than, for example, from the Sony cameras I just talked about. Even though this camera is from the same era, it was released in 2014, but the autofocus is better. So if you are into, for example, portrait or sports photography or something where you have fast moving objects, I would prefer the Nikon, honestly, because the autofocus is so much better. It also comes with a dual SD card slot. I talked about that before, which is really important for some occasions. So also a pretty solid choice, I feel like. So let's talk about the absolute champion of cheap full frame cameras. I'm talking about a Canon EOS 5D Mark I. I remember back in the day, the 5D was the champion of cameras. At the time I really got into photography, we already had the 5D Mark II and Mark III, but the 5D Mark I is an iconic camera and you can get them super cheap. I once saw a working 5D Mark I camera on eBay for, I believe, $99. It had a pretty rough exterior, to be honest. You get cameras in way better condition for around $150 to $200, which is also an absolute bargain. It is a 20 years old camera. So this one was released in 2005. It comes with a 12 megapixel sensor. Again, the megapixels are not so important, so I believe 12 megapixels is good for most occasions. For example, when you post your photos on social media, or if you want to make, decently sized prints, like for example 20 inches wide or something like that, then 12 megapixels will be more than enough. And the looks of these photos, they have some kind of a retro vibe, I have to admit it, but it still looks pretty good. And I feel like this retro vibe comes through the fact that the images are very little processed. So you basically have a very raw form of photography, the basics of photography. It is great for everyone who wants to start out, for example, with photography, want to learn the basics first and, just got into the world of photography, because honestly, what better camera you can get for $200 out there? It obviously comes with some downsides due to the age. For example, cannot record any video, but I feel like if you buy a 5D Mark I, you don't want to shoot video with it. And obviously the whole interface, the whole operating of the camera, it feels not modern anymore. Again, it is 20 years old, but nonetheless, this is my favorite hidden gem of this list, because you get so much camera for so little money. You got so many different lenses out there. Most of them are quite old and used today, obviously. Nonetheless, you can get amazing deals when you look on the used market. So this camera, again, is my favorite of this list and an absolute recommendation for anybody who wants to start out with full frame photography. So here we are. This is the end of this list. And this video is basically a follow-up to my last video that I posted on this channel, where I talked about 5 cheap lenses that offers great value for money. Same with the cameras today, but I know that there are a ton of great cameras out there and I did not mention all of them. This has 2 reasons. First of all, I don't know all of these cameras. And the second reason is that this list just consists of cameras that I used myself. I did not own any one of these cameras, but I used them over time. For example, I borrowed one of friends or just tried it out. So yeah, this is the reason for the list today. But let me know what your secret tips are for cheap and best value for money cameras. But for now, I want to say thanks for tuning in today. I have a ton of other videos about photography related topics over on my channel. Feel free to check them out as well if you want to. And feel also free to leave a like, leave a subscription here if you like this video. That would be amazing. But for now, I wish you a great day. I wish you a great week and I hope I see you in next week's video. So see you then and goodbye.